It's my pleasure to extend a hearty welcome to all of you for the third day HTTP afternoon session. Myself Anju, Assistant Professor from Department of Information Technology. Today we have a knowledge enabling session on zero knowledge proof and their applications in blockchain. We have an eminent speaker for this session, Mr. Shubham Sai, researcher, Microsoft Research India, IIT Kanpur. Shubham Sai is a final year PhD student at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, IIT Kanpur, and currently a research intern at Microsoft Research India. He has a keen interest in designing systems that guarantee trust and privacy among users, with technologies such as blockchain, trusted execution environment, and cryptography. His peripheral interest in cryptography revolves zero knowledge proof of DSRAM and homomorphic encryption. And he believes this construction will play a pivotal role in the development of secure, trustworthy, and privacy preserving digital world. He has also explored problems in computational number theory and algebra, and he worked an integer factorization during the early years of PhD. On behalf of management of KCT College of Technology and Department of Information Technology, I welcome our speaker, Mr. Shubham Sai, for this afternoon session. Welcome you, sir. Now the platform is for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Let me share the screen. Is the screen visible?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So in this session, we'll talk about some cryptographic constructions known as zero knowledge proofs. And we'll see what are its potential applications and how we can use them in blockchains to have a privacy preserving solutions for some problems. So to set a background a little bit, blockchain and privacy sort of don't go well hand in hand. So when Nakamoto created Bitcoin first, his intentions was to have privacy in the sense of pseudo-anonymity. However, recent research has shown that you can perform transaction graph analysis and you can monitor the exchanges and de-anonymize a lot of transactions that happen over the blockchain, particularly in Bitcoin and Ethereum. There have been constructions in the past, such as zero knowledge proofs, that have been sitting on the shelves, which have been cleverly applied over blockchains to preserve privacy in terms of Zcash, if you're aware of. So what does blockchain offer out of the box? So blockchain does offer you immutability. It gives you sensor resistance. No one can block your blockchain, and it's open and permissionless in most of the cases. So the blockchain world progressed from the blockchain version, which I would like to call blockchain version 1.0, which is Bitcoins, to what we have now are pretty sophisticated systems where you can run business logics. So with the introduction of blockchain and with Bitcoin, what it offers was pseudo-anonymity. There was a public ledger of records where all these transactions were recorded. However, there was de-anonymization of the pseudo-anonymity or the transaction addresses which were possible. And mostly they supported transactions where you want to transfer certain cryptocurrency from one party to another. With advent of Ethereum, somehow this is stuck. Just a second, I think. Yeah, okay. Yeah, sorry about that. So there was just some technical glitch. I was not able to progress the slides. So with the introduction to Ethereum, we can do more than transactions. It gives us the facility to use smart contracts, and what we can create now is decentralized applications. So you can handle data over the blockchains, and you can write some business logic using programming languages such as Solidity over the Ethereum smart contracts. And you can execute these smart contracts over all peers and ensure that there is no biases or no malicious Uh, yeah, I'm sorry, there is some technical glitch from this end. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So seems my laptop is a bit malfunctioning right now. Yeah, okay, it's working fine now. Okay. Uh, and finally, we have what we call blockchain 3.0 with the advent of blockchains such as Hyperledger Fabric, where you have further support over these privacy issues, such as support of channels and support for faster consensus algorithms, which can host a lot of business logics. However, all these blockchains-based solutions, they do the transactions that happen, they are often public in nature, where every participant can see what transaction is happening, what is the data that is being sent across, which sort of limits the use cases of these blockchains to business solutions, where the business entities would ideally do not want to share their business sensitive data across. Okay. So there have been a lot of applications of blockchains, which starting from cryptocurrencies with the advent of Bitcoins and wallets to games such as CryptoKitties, identity management, and some microblogging based applications on top of Ethereum. Further, with the Hyperledger Fabric, there have been applications such as supply chain management and traceability solutions such as IBM Food Trust or traceability over diamond minings, etc. So starting from the management of simple transactions where you transfer cryptocurrencies from one entity to other, moving towards managing sophisticated business logic, blockchain has gone a long way. However, the question is, what else can we do? Is this somebody scribbling over the screen? Okay. So can we integrate non-blockchain solutions with blockchain? Can we integrate non-blockchain based solutions with blockchains to achieve something even more? Sure, we can, but the major hindrance that comes is privacy. So in businesses, the data is crucial. And in blockchain, everything goes in a public ledger. Of course, Hyperledger Fabric came up with solutions such as having channels, but they are not enough because in a participating channel, it's public to every participating entities. So what can we do more? What can we do about preserving these privacy or providing privacy guarantees over these blockchain-based solutions? Before we start with the with the actual content, let's see what mathematics or crypto we know of so far. So we know that there are something known as one-way hash functions or one-way functions such as cryptographic hashes, which are used to connect the blocks together. We are aware there are digital signatures where you sign each and every transactions which are coming onto the blockchain. And there are certain authentication mechanisms using which you can authenticate a user, and you can manage the user base on your systems, such as in Hyperledger Fabric, etc. You have a certifying authority to do that. In this talk, we'll see two interesting crypto primitives additionally, which are zero knowledge proofs and ZK snarks. Essentially, ZK snarks, which can be used on top of the existing blockchains to provide some additional privacy preserving guarantees. So the outline of this talk is that I want to divide this talk into three parts. In the first half an hour to 45 minutes, we'll discuss in general what are zero knowledge proofs. Post that, we'll discuss what is known as ZK snarks, which are succinct non-interactive arguments of knowledge. This section would be for 45 minutes and will be a bit math heavy. But these are the constructions which provide non-interactive shorter proofs, zero knowledge proofs, which can be used in blockchains to give certain privacy guarantees. And in the last 30 minutes or so, we'll look at an application where you can have a privacy preserving traceability solution over the supply chains in real world. Additionally, between all of these parts, we'll roughly have a 5-minute breaks between each of these parts where we can discuss any questions and any question about the content so far. So we can use the hand raising mechanism in Zoom and address these questions. Okay, so let's start with the first part, just zero knowledge proofs. So it was first proposed roughly 3 decades back now by MIT researchers Goldwasser, Micali, and Rakoff, which gives general idea of proofs with zero knowledge complexity. So essentially, you are able to prove the truthfulness of certain statement without revealing any extra information. So there has been decades of research which has been put into zero knowledge proofs, and it has existed on our cryptographic, quote unquote, cryptographic shelves for long enough. However, they have seen the light of the day with the advent of blockchains and have gained a lot more interest since blockchains due to their potentials to provide privacy preserving solutions on top of it. And in general, they have a potential to redefine the online privacy, where you can generate proofs of statements without revealing any additional information. So you can prove certain. So imagine a situation where you can prove that your age is greater than 18 years without actually revealing your date of birth or giving away your entire credential, such as Aadhaar or your driving license. So yeah, so let's see what zero knowledge proofs are in general. So let's start with a very simple example. So imagine there are two entities, Alice and Bob. Okay, and Bob is colorblind. So Alice has two hats, one of red color, one of green color. But Bob is colorblind, so all he can see is two hats of some identical color, let's say yellow color. So in this situation, how does Alice convince Bob that these two hats are indeed of two different colors and not the same color, yellow, which Bob sees? Now, because Alice is claiming them to be of different colors, then probably she can see and distinguish between the two hats, one being a red hat, other being a green hat, which Bob cannot. So what Bob does is, he goes behind a curtain, wears one hat, discards the other, and then comes out of the curtain and asks Alice what particular hat is he wearing. So Alice here says that Alice can see whether the color of the hat is a red hat or a green hat. And she answers color one. So notice, she does not say whether it's a red hat or a green hat. She just says it's a hat of color one, and where color one could be anything. Now Bob could repeat the same experiment. So Bob again goes behind the curtain, and now he has a choice whether he wants to switch the hat or keep wearing the same hat, and comes out again. Again, if these two hats were indeed of different color, then Alice could see whether the hats have been switched or not. In this case, the hat has not been switched, and she can call out again whether the hat is of the color one, which she said earlier, or the color two, or of the second color, without revealing the actual color. And Bob can continue repeating the experiment while switching the hat, with the choice of switching the hat or not switching the hat. And if he switches, she could see that the hat has been switched and call out that now you're wearing a color 2 hat. So what has Bob accomplished doing these set of interactions or experiments with playing this game with Alice? So if Alice is cheating, then the probability of fooling Bob at any point of time would be 1/2. Because Alice claims that the two hats are of two different colors, whereas Bob cannot distinguish between them. So Bob says that they are of same color. So if Alice is cheating, then with the probability half, Bob could have decided to switch the hat or keep wearing the same hat. And if Alice is just doing a random guess, so Alice is actually guessing here whether Bob has switched or not. However, if these two hats are indeed of different color, what Alice has accomplished is that she would at every point of time would know whether Bob has switched the hat or not. And she could call out whether the hat has been switched or not by saying color is the first color or the second color. Right? So at the end of the experiment, if Alice is able to convince, Alice is able to answer correctly whether the hat has been switched or not, then Bob is convinced that these two hats are indeed of different color, without Alice revealing that what are the actual colors of the hat. So all she says is whether the hat has been switched or not, or whether you are wearing the first color or the second color. However, if Alice is cheating, then the probability is 1/2 because she will be randomly guessing whether whether Bob has switched the hat or not. So if Bob repeats this experiment n number of times, then the probability of fooling Bob will reduce to 1/2 to the n. And for repeating the experiment such as n equal to 14, this probability is fairly low. So in the end, Alice is able to convince Bob that with very high probability, she has different colored hats if she has been answering the calls correctly. Is there a question? Okay. However, Bob has no idea what the colors of the hat is. So in some sense, this gives a gist of what a very, introduction to what zero knowledge proofs are. So here Alice is able to convince Bob of certain statement, the truthfulness of a certain statement. In this case, she has different colored hats, which is our statement, without revealing any extra information such as what are the colors of those hats. The only information she convinces Bob is that the hats are indeed of different colors. And because Bob is colorblind, there's no way Bob could figure out what are the actual colors of the hats. So zero knowledge proofs sort of this game sums up the properties of zero knowledge proofs, which is that it's a method by which any parties known as prover can convince another party, which we'll call verifier, about the truthfulness of the statement without revealing anything else apart from whether the statement is true or false. So the knowledge revealed is zero. And any zero knowledge proof protocol should satisfy these three properties. So one is completeness. An honest prover can convince an honest verifier. So if Alice is honest and the hats are indeed of two different colors, then she should be able to convince Bob that they are of different color by calling out every time whether the hat has been switched or not. It should be sound. So a cheating prover can convince an honest verifier with negligible probability, which we have already seen, that the probability of convincing Bob if Alice is actually cheating is 1/2 to the n. So in this case, it would be close to 0 if n is large enough, sufficiently large. And third, that the protocol should have zero knowledge, which means the verifier learns nothing apart from whether the statement is true or false. Which is again true in this case, because all Bob learns is whether Alice is able to detect whether he has switched the hat or not. And if she's able to do that, then the two hats are distinguishable to Alice, which means that they are of two different colors, which Bob cannot distinguish. And Bob, at the end of the experiment, has no idea what are the exact colors of these two hats. He just knows that these two hats have two different colors. The protocols which we have seen, the protocol which we have seen thus is something which is known as an interactive zero knowledge proof protocol. So why interactive? Because every round of this game, Bob goes behind the curtain, changes his hats, comes again, and then again asks Alice the question whether the switch was made or not. And there's a continuous interaction between Alice and Bob, which is required to establish the truthfulness of the statement. Now, ideally, we would not want this for a blockchain-based solution, because essentially we would want that once you give a proof, that proof should be verifiable by every miner and every participant of the blockchain without actually interacting with the prover. So we'll get to that part in the second part of this talk, that how can we reduce this interactiveness and we can have a proof where the verification of the proof does not require any interaction. Okay, so this was a good example. This was a cute example, but what can we do with such systems? So let's try to beef things up with more useful and practical example. And that example is preceded by the following result, that all languages in NP have a zero knowledge proof. So recall NP is a class of language which are difficult to solve, but are easier to verify. So in some sense, a one-way puzzle where you can prove once you have a solution or a witness, you can prove that you have the correct witness, or you can prove that the solution exists for this particular problem. But finding that witness is a hard task. So yeah, so it's basically a set of decision problems where if the answer is yes, then there are proof which are known as witnesses, which are verifiable in polynomial time. And essentially, this theorem says that all languages in NP can have a zero knowledge proof. So what we do when we want to prove this, essentially you pick up an NP complete language, an NP complete problem, and shows that it has a solution, and then all NP can be reduced to this problem. So in this case, we pick up this graph 3 coloring problem. So what is the graph 3 coloring problem? So imagine there is an undirected graph. So the problem is there a way to color each node of a graph such that no two adjacent nodes have the same color? So what are adjacent nodes? So adjacent nodes are any two nodes that are connected by an edge. So what we want is that given a graph, can I color this graph with just 3 different colors such that no two nodes connected by edge have the same color? This problem is known to be NP complete. And finding the solution to this problem is indeed hard. However, if I give you such a coloring, you can simply see that all you need to do is go through every edge, which is order m, if there are m edges, and just see whether both the nodes corresponding to each of these edge have 2 different colors or not. So it's verifiable in polynomial time, but finding the solution for 3 coloring is a hard problem. So consider this, that there is a graph with n vertices and m different edges. And Alice claims now that, hey, this graph G is 3 colorable, and I know the coloring of this graph. So naturally, Bob would say, like, prove these coloring. But as we know, finding the coloring is a really hard problem. Alice does not want to actually give the actual coloring of this graph, but she wants to prove that she knows the coloring. So there's a graph, there is a huge graph, maybe millions of nodes, and she would have spent her lifetime to find a 3 coloring. And now she does not want to reveal that 3 coloring for free to Bob, but she wants to still prove that, okay, I know the 3 coloring, and if you pay me, I'll give you the 3 coloring. And at the same time, Bob does not want to get cheated. So Bob does not want I pay you the money to get this 3 coloring, and in the end, you do not have this 3 coloring. So I'll have to, fight back to get my money back. So Bob wants to be convinced before paying that you actually know this coloring. So the protocol. So what is a zero knowledge proof protocol that we can follow? So let's see how zero knowledge proofs can come to the rescue. So as Alice knows the coloring, she can choose random assignments of 3 colors. So she can choose any 3 colors, let's say red, green, blue, or whatever. And then she can color the graph. So recall, when she knows the 3 coloring, she knows that what are the corresponding colors for each of the nodes, and the actual colors doesn't matter. So she can use any 3 random colors. And then she can lock these colors in a box. Okay, so we'll see how we do that in our real world setting. But for now, imagine that there is a wooden box, and she locks the colors for each of the nodes in that wooden box and send that box to Bob. Okay, so the key to this box is with Alice, and Bob can open this box if the key is given by Alice, and he can reveal what is the color for this particular node. So this is for one node. Similarly, she does the same thing for all the nodes of this graph. So now Bob has sealed envelopes, or the sealed boxes corresponding to the colors of each of the nodes. Okay. But he cannot see what each boxes contain because they are locked and the keys are with Alice. So how does Bob proceed ahead? So Bob now randomly chooses an edge E from this graph. So this edge E, what does that mean? So there will be two nodes corresponding to this edge, which Bob has chosen. And if the graph is indeed three colorable, then any edge chosen by Bob should have different colors on its nodes. So now Bob requests the keys for these two boxes corresponding to the edge E. And Alice replies with these keys, and Bob opens these boxes and verifies if they are of the same color or not. So if these two colors are different, then all that this guarantees is that Bob has chosen an edge which was correctly colored. Okay. So before we go ahead, while implementing, what can these boxes be? So these boxes could be any one-way function, such as, let's say, a hash function, where you choose a color for each of these edges, and then a random nonce, maybe let's say a 64-bit nonce, and you concatenate the color with the nonce. So let's say colors are 1, 2, and 3. So you concatenate one with this random nonce, and you compute the hash of this function, and you send it to Bob. So by the properties of hash function, getting this SHA-256 hash, Bob cannot get the plain text which hashed to this particular value. However, if Alice reveals the actual color, which is 1, 2, or 3, and the random nonce associated or a random number associated with this particular node, then Bob can always concatenate these two and apply SHA-256 and verify whether the SHA-256 shared by Alice is same as this or not, and can verify whether this color one was same or not. And later on, for both of these nodes, you know what are the color values, which is one of the 1, 2, or 3, and you can compare whether they are of different colors or not. Okay, so as of now, what Bob has accomplished is that he knows that whatever random edge he has chosen, they were correctly colored. And as usual, as we saw earlier, you repeat the same experiment a couple of times. So what is this couple of times? So how many times do we need to repeat this experiment in this case? So if Alice is cheating, okay, then what is the probability of fooling Bob? So if Alice is actually cheating, then there is at least one edge which is not correctly colored. It could be more, but at least there is one edge where the two nodes are not, so where the two adjacent nodes are colored improperly or they have the same color. So the probability of fooling Bob in this case is m1 minus 1 over n. So if Bob chooses that one wrong edge or the incorrectly colored edge, Bob wins and he can figure out that Alice was cheating. And for the rest of the m minus 1 edges, Bob will get the correct color. So if we repeat this experiment m square number of times, which is polynomial in the size of the graph, then for m as small as 7, the probability comes out to be really low. So yeah, so repeating it m square number of times, so you can with very high probability ensure that if by the end of the experiment Alice was able to give you keys corresponding to two nodes which were adjacent and correctly colored, then the graph with very high probability is 3 colorable, and Alice knows the 3 coloring. Okay. It's crucial to understand that when I say repeat the experiment in the previous slide, I mean repeat the entire experiment again and again. So that is, Alice again chooses 3 random colors, assign them to each of the nodes, again encrypts them and send them to Bob, and Bob reveals an edge again. Why this is important? Because if Alice is not let's say relocking, quote unquote, these edges, if she's not committing with a fresh set of colors, then with enough sufficient number of requests, Bob can figure out what exactly are the color of this entire graph and can figure out the entire 3 coloring. So every time the entire experiment is repeated every time. So recall, we said that any zero knowledge proof protocol needs to have these three properties of completeness, soundness, and zero knowledge. So we can verify that the graph indeed, so the graph three coloring protocol which we gave indeed satisfies these three properties. So whereas an honest prover can convince an honest verifier. So if indeed you know the three coloring, it doesn't matter what edge Bob has chosen, Alice will always be able to reveal the edges, and those edges will be correctly colored. It is sound, where a cheating prover can not convince an honest verifier with a very high probability. And the verifier learns nothing apart from that the graph is recolorable, because every time the experiment is repeated again, and the coloring cannot be revealed. So from the complexity standpoint, the computational zero knowledge proofs lies in this space. And what is important for us is that all languages in NP, they have a zero knowledge proofs, which we just proved here using the graph three coloring example. Okay. So can we apply these zero knowledge proofs in blockchain in the current form? So apparently no, because the protocols which we have seen so far are interactive in nature. So they are certainly not suitable for blockchains, because in blockchain, as we discussed earlier, once you share a proof, you would not want an interaction between the verifier and the prover. And you would want that once the proof is there on the blockchain, any third party or the miner can actually look at the proof and check or verify the proof, whether the proof is correct or not, without any interaction with the original verifier. So a desirable properties for a zero knowledge proof variant, which can be useful for blockchains, is that it should have non-interactiveness, where once a proof is there, anyone can verify it. It should be small in size, because the proof has to sit on the blockchain, and what that means is that it needs to be replicated across all the peers, and the size of the proof is very important. And last of all, it should support a faster verification time, because they need to be executed by every miner or while they're submitted, and they need to be executed by every peer to verify them. And a faster verification time is crucial for applications. And in some cases, such as Ethereum, they actually cost gas. So everything is money there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so time for questions. So are there any questions so far?
Participants, if you have any queries, you can unmute and you can ask, or you can post it in the chat box.
Are there any queries, or shall we proceed?
So you can proceed, sir.
Okay. Okay, so up till now, what we have seen is a simple example of what zero knowledge proofs are and what can we accomplish. So essentially, we can have proof for every NP statement. And we have seen examples of protocols where you can interactively, the prover and the verifier can interact with each other. I can pass messages between each other, and they can establish the truthfulness of the statement. Now, let's start with what is known as zk-SNARKs, which is a technology that enables the non-interactive part of this proof. So zk-SNARKs stand for zero knowledge succinct non-interactive arguments of knowledge. So it contains non-interactive in its name, and essentially you can have succinct proofs which are small in size, which can have potentially faster verification times and can be used in applications such as blockchain. So what are non-interactive zero knowledge proofs? So non-interactive zero knowledge proofs are zero knowledge proof protocols which require no interaction, as the name suggests, between the prover and the verifier. So the result is impossible in standard cryptographic model. However, under common reference string or a random oracle model, we can have pretty efficient zk-SNARKs. And common reference strings model can yield to something which is known as computational zero knowledge proofs. So I'll not go into details of what are these different models and what do you mean by computational zero knowledge proof, but essentially the gist is that if there is a common reference string which can be established between the prover and the verifier beforehand, then you can have a zero knowledge proofs which any polynomially bounded adversary cannot break in the sense that you cannot reveal any knowledge from that proof for any polynomial bounded adversaries. So essentially zk-SNARKs, as we have discussed till now, this does not require any interaction with the prover, and a proof once generated can be verified by anyone. And to establish this, we need some shared reference string between the prover and the verifier. So this is usually done in what is known as a one-time setup phase. And the version which we are going to discuss now, it generates toxic waste. It is something known as a one-time trusted setup. So a trusted setup generates a toxic waste. And this is also what is used in Zcash. The protocol which we are going to discuss is used in Zcash. There are other variants of SNARKs as well, such as a transparent SNARKs, which does not require a trusted setup and does not generate toxic waste. And then there are also generic SNARKs where you need not do this setup phase for every circuit that you want to prove. But for the purpose of this talk, we'll stick to the simplest of all. So for every function, we need to generate to run this setup phase. So when I say every function, so every new problem that you want to prove in, so if it's graph recoloring or if it's a hat or if it's any different problem that you want to prove, you need to run this setup phase and generate a reference string and share them between the prover and the verifier. So yeah, you can call them a proving key and a verification key for the purpose of this protocol. So what can we do with it? So imagine something like, so Bob comes up and say that I know a value of x such that x cubed plus x plus 5 is equal to 35. Of course, this equation, like all of us can solve, and this is a simple equation. But essentially, imagine this could be a very complicated computation, such as you would say that I know a plain text string such that the SHA-256 hash of that string is some value. So some hexadecimal value which you reveal in publicly in plain text, and you say that you know actually what hashed through this value. Okay. So this is just a representative computations to make these slides simple, but you can go to any complicated example, such as computing the hash or proving some complicated NP statement. So while we discuss application, we'll see some real world use cases and some complicated NP statements which you can prove with these zk-SNARKs. Okay. And as usual, as we have seen and we got a hang of it till now, that the verifier in this case, Alice, would want Bob to prove it. Now, of course, a simple way would be to Bob to just give that value of x, which will compute this equation to 35. But you won't do that at zero knowledge. So we want to convince Alice that we know x without revealing this value of x. Okay. So let's try to work out this example through the next 40 minutes or so. So this equation can simply be written as the following function, which takes as input value x and returns you the finally computed value x cubed plus x plus 5. And you want to prove that you know an x such that q eval of x is equal to 35. Okay. Now the first step is to flatten this piece of code. So where you just have one operator on the right side and two operands. So this could be simplified into this sim1 is equal to x times x, y is equal to sim1 times x. So here y essentially becomes x cubed. Then some symbol 2 is equal to y plus x. So you get x cubed plus x. And then finally the output is sim2 plus 5, where output becomes x cubed plus x plus 5. So essentially the right side and the left side are the same, computes the same thing. The only difference is that the right side now has just one operand on the right side of each equality. Okay. So what does this gives us? So essentially, what this gives us is what is known as an arithmetic circuit with fan-in 2. So what it is? So an arithmetic circuit is simply, you can think of a tree like a structure where every leaf node correspond to some input or a constant here. So some input from the outer world, quote unquote outer world, and every internal node corresponds to a plus or a multiplication gate. Right. So the flattened code, what it gave us is it gave us this uniformity where every gate in this circuit has 2 inputs and 1 output, right? Because as we can clearly see, the left side of equality contains 1 symbol and the right side of the equality contains 2 symbols. And for this simple piece of code, all we have is a multiplication and addition operations. So essentially the right side of the circuit, if we right side of the screen, if we see, is a tree representation of the flattened code, which we see towards the left. Right. So here sim1 is just x times x, and y is sim1 times x, and out is sim2 plus 5, and so on. So this arithmetic circuit actually imposes a constraint on its input and output. So every gate in this circuit. So let's see this particular gate. So this gate imposes constraints on x, y, and sim2. And the constraint is that x plus y is equal to sim2. This is a simple constraint that is there. Similarly, if we pick any other gate, we have another constraint. So in this case, x times sim1 is y, right? So every input and output for every gate, there is a constraint. And we can represent these constraints in something which is known as a rank 1 constraint system. So for the next 15 to 20 minutes of this message, if you have any issues, I would request you to just stop me there then and there, because that would be crucial to understand the entire material. So just stop me whenever you have any issues. Yeah. Okay. So what is a rank 1 constraint system? So to simplify, a rank 1 constraint system is just a sequence of 3 vectors and a solution vector S, which satisfies this equation: S dot A times S dot B minus S dot C is 0. Okay. So don't worry if it looks complicated. Let's see this simply. So we'll represent the constraint corresponding to each of the gates in R1CS as a rank 1 system. So we'll see an example. But for now, just let's try to understand what each of these terms mean. So in this case, A would correspond to the left input to the gate. B would correspond to the right input to the gate. And C would be the output of the gate. Right? And S is something which will be solution vector. Let's see an example. So this is the circuit which we had out of that flattened code. Okay. So let's first fix a variable ordering among all these variables. So the ordering doesn't matter, but we need to fix one. So let's randomly fix this. Okay, where the inputs and the auxiliary outputs are taken. So x and y. So x is the input to this function, and sim1, y, sim2, and output are the outputs. And there's a special input which is 1, which is just to handle the constants. And yeah, we'll discuss a bit about why this special 1. So this special 1 just treat it as the numeric 1. So that is just to handle the constants. Okay. So once we have fixed this ordering among all the variables, so we'll pick up a gate, and recall that every gate corresponds to a constraint. And for every gate, we can take that constraint and generate R1CS constraint out of it. Okay, so let's pick up a gate. Okay. So from this circuit, we will be picking up one gate, which is a multiplication gate, which imposes the constraint that y is equal to sim1 times x. So this constraint was straightforward when we saw when we try to understand what the arithmetic circuit is imposing the constraint. So how we can represent it as a R1CS constraint? Simply, A, recall, it's the left input to the gate. So in this case, see the pink vector at the top. So the left input to this gate is sim1. And sim1 is nothing but the fourth entry to this vector. So the corresponding A is simply a vector with 1 at just the fourth entry, which is corresponding to sim1. Okay. Similarly, the right gate, which is B, is corresponding to X. Now we can clearly see from the above vector that X is the second entry of this pink vector. So our constraint B would be 0, 1, and all zeros, which means that 1 is as the second entry. And similarly, Y is the second last entry, which is the fifth entry of this vector. So Y is 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0. Okay. So these three constraints are simple constraints which has one corresponding to the position denoted by the respective inputs and outputs to them, where A is the left input, B is the right input, and C is the output. Okay. So in this case, A is sim1, fourth entry, B is X, second entry, and Y is and C is Y, which is the fifth entry. Okay. So what is a solution vector? So a solution vector is simply a vector which can assign values to this inputs and outputs. So in this case, X, Y, and sim1, such that the equation holds. So in this case, the solution vector is 0, 3, 0, 5, 15, 0. So where 3 is corresponding to X from the pink vector above, 5 is corresponding to sim1, and 15 is corresponding to Y. And we can clearly see that 5 times 3 is 15. And if we do a simple dot product, then S dot A is 5 times S dot B, which is 3, minus S dot C, which is 15, is equal to 0 holds. So, any issues so far? Okay, let's go ahead. So we generate constraints corresponding to each of the gates above. So let's try to take a step back and recall what we have done so far. So we wanted to prove a function in zero knowledge. We'll see how we prove it in zero knowledge. That's a different solution, but what we have got so far. So we first took that function, which was a function which was computing x cubed plus x plus y, x plus 5 is equal to 35. We flattened out that code. We generated an arithmetic circuit out of it, such that every gate, the internal gates were corresponding to a multiplication or an addition gate, and every leaf was corresponding to inputs. In this case, just X. And finally, we figured out that every internal gate of this arithmetic circuit imposes a constraint on the system. And we used R1CS constraints to write those constraints in the following form, which we see in front of us. And next step is naturally represent all the gates as R1CS constraints. So this is just one gate. So we want to represent all of these gates as R1CS constraint. Okay. So this was the arithmetic circuit. It has 4 gates, 2 multiplication, 2 addition gates. And we want to represent all of these gates as R1CS constraint. And this is the corresponding constraint system which you get. Okay. So this matrix type looking structure corresponding to A, B, and C are, as discussed, constraints with respect to the left input. So A is with respect to the left input to the gates, B is with respect to the right input, and C is with respect to the output. And as there were 4 gates, there are 4 rows corresponding to each this capital A, B, or C, where each row is an R1CS constraint with respect to one of the gates of that arithmetic circuit. So if you have a complicated function, the size of this circuit would be maybe thousands of gates. And similarly, your R1CS constraint would be a huge set of vectors. Okay. What is our task here? So we want to find a solution vector S which satisfies each of these constraints simultaneously. So when we say we want to come up with a solution vector S, what essentially we are saying? We are saying that we want to assign values to each of these inputs and auxiliary inputs. So in this case, X, out, sim1, Y, sim2, and so on. So we want to assign values to each one of them such that nothing gets violated throughout the circuit. Okay. So in this case, S gets the following value. And if we simply do a dot product corresponding to any of the constraints, so we pick any random row, let's say the last row, and if we try to do that, so what will the last row give us? So last row will give us 5 times 1, which is 5, plus 30 times 1, which is 35, times B, which is 1, minus C dot S, which will give you 35. So 35 minus 35 times 1 minus 35 is 0, which holds true. And similarly, you can verify that this holds true for each of these rows. And every row, as discussed, is corresponding to a gate of the circuit. So essentially, we came up with a solution vector S, which can solve this arithmetic circuit in a way that all of these constraints are simultaneously satisfied, and the equation, the final circuit is satisfied. Okay. Now the question is, the goal is, of course, to come up with this that satisfies all of these constraints simultaneously. But how do we verify them? So we just verified for the last gate, which was like 35 times 1 minus 35 is 0. So one way to do that will be that you solve each of these R1CS equation corresponding to the solution vector. So you come up with a solution vector, and then you simply multiply, take dot product and solve for each of these vectors. Now, which is a computationally intensive task? And the question is, can we do better? And yes, the answer is we can. Okay. So let's park whatever we have understood so far, and try to get to a further generalized representation of these constraint systems, something known as quadratic arithmetic programs. So these QAPs actually implement the same logic as R1CS, but they use polynomials instead of the simple dot products which we have seen. Okay, so we will have the same setup, but we'll use polynomials instead of dot products. And to verify, we just need to solve this QAP for the entire system just once. So recall, till now, to verify what we need to do, we need to solve each of these constraints corresponding to the solution vector. Now we want to reduce it to the polynomial problem, and then polynomials, and then we just want to solve that polynomial system just once and be done with it. Okay, so it will be a system of something of this form. So if you see it, it looks similar-ish, right? So there also we have that A dot S times B dot S minus C dot S is 0, which is somewhat in this fashion, right? So A times X, A of X times B of X is equal to C of X. It has a similar notion. Okay, so this was the R1CS circuit, R1CS constraints, which we had in a couple of slides back. Okay, so first thing, you visualize that each gates are numbered from 0 to n. So in this case, n is 3. So each gate in the original arithmetic circuit which we saw for the flattened code, you just number them. And corresponding to each of these gate, there is this R1CS constraint which is sitting in front of it. So whatever the ordering and the numbering you choose, doesn't matter. Okay. Now look at the first column. So you'll want to come up with a polynomial that passes through the point 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, and 3, 5. Okay. So we combine the first entry of the vectors corresponding to each of these constraints, and we come up with this polynomial a1x. Okay. So what do we get out of it? So in this polynomial, if you plug in the value 0, you get the first entry of the vector corresponding to the constraint of the gate 0. If you plug in 1, you get the first entry of the constraint corresponding to the gate 1. If you plug in 3, you get the first entry corresponding to the gate 3, and so on. Similarly, you can combine all of these columns. So this will become A2x, this will become B2x, this will become C4x, and so on and so forth. So essentially, you get a system such as this, right? So where your A is this polynomial, A1x, A2x, B, A3x, A4x, and so on. Similarly, B and C, right? And as we discussed earlier, so you choose a value of x corresponding to any gate you are interested in. You plug in that values in all of these polynomials, and you will get a R1CS constraint corresponding to that gate, right? So you choose a x, you get a constraint. So this capital AX, BX, and CX is nothing but a dot product with corresponding to the solution vector. So your AX is nothing but summation of SI times A1X. This might look complicated, but let's try to sync this a bit, and I'll be happy to answer any doubts as of now. But essentially, what we are doing is that instead of coming up with a bunch of equations of the form S dot A times S dot B minus S dot C, we sort of has reduced this to this following A times X time A of X times B of X minus C of X, where they are essentially capturing the same thing, because once you put in any value of X, you get the same equation A dot S times B dot S minus C dot S corresponding to that particular gate. So you pick x0, you get the first constraint, you pick x1, you get the second, and similarly you get all the 4 constraints. But instead now you have a polynomial equation, and we want to show that this should be 0 for all x corresponding to circuit gates, which is equivalent to saying that you want all those R1CS constraints to be satisfied simultaneously. A same way of saying this. So any doubts so far? It's very important that you have followed so far. Is there any doubt, or shall we continue?
So there is a question in the chat box.
I cannot.
Yeah, I will tell you. Apart from private and public keys, SHA algorithm, do you have any other security algorithm in blockchain?
Can the person who has asked the question come up and explain what do you mean by this? I'm sorry, I don't think I follow the question.
Hello, sir. Good
Yeah.
afternoon, sir.
Hi.
Sir, we have private and public keys, no, sir? In blockchain, we have private and public keys, and SHA algorithm. Most commonly, whenever we talk about security, we are telling about SHA algorithm. Do we have any other security algorithms in blockchain?
Well, essentially SHA is just a hash algorithm, and you can potentially have any hash algorithm. And the purpose of SHA mainly is to connect the blocks, and people have chosen SHA-256 as a de facto standard to connect these blocks in this blockchain. Whereas the public and private keys could be corresponding to ECDSA, or could be corresponding to RSA, or any public-private key encryption algorithms, where you'd use them for signing your transactions and for proving that you own the private keys corresponding to any particular coin which you are transacting. I'm assuming this question is with respect to Bitcoins and Ethereum, but in general, yes. So basically you need a public key cryptography algorithm and some commitment algorithm, such as SHA is just an example where you can use them to connect these blocks. Essentially, when you get into the domain of zero knowledge proofs and you go into the privacy preserving techniques, such as you look into the blockchain such as zero cash, there you use complicated algorithms such as this Pinochet protocol, which we are discussing right now, to prove that the mass transaction which you see. So in Bitcoin, you usually see a transaction in the form that A sends some Bitcoins to B, where A and B are corresponding to the public addresses for two entities, which could be potentially the same entities. In Zcash, all of this is encrypted. So you see, you don't see who is the sender, you don't see who is the receiver, you don't see what is the amount of the coins that are being transferred. And additionally, there is a proof which is a zero knowledge proof using which you can verify that although you cannot see what exactly are the is the sender, receiver, and the amount which is being transacted, but still they conform to the laws of the blockchain, which means that whoever the sender is, he somehow owns the amount of cryptocurrency, which whatever the number is, but he owns those many cryptocurrencies which it is transacting to some valid receiver, and you don't know anything apart from that. So depending upon the solution you are looking into, yes, there could be more cryptographic algorithms. There's nothing special about SHA or RSA here. It could be any public key cryptographic algorithm and any hash functions which can be used. But yes. So did
Thank
I
you,
answer
sir.
your question?
Yes, there is, sir. Thank you, sir.
Is there any other question?
Yes, sir. We have one more question. Whether SHA is more secure than TDS, triple DDS?
Well, I don't know how to answer that. So essentially, it's a yes or a no. So you cannot compare them per se at a de facto level, but both of them offer pretty decent cryptographic guarantees in terms of hash functions. Also, elliptic curve cryptography is the way to go in the way ahead of us due to its guarantees and due to certain algorithms that work over elliptic curves, which provide you the faster and secure algorithms. But yeah, apart from that, I'm not sure how to answer that, but because both of them are pretty secure, and even SHA-256 has no known attacks, which is in general attacks which are possible, as opposed to the older encryption hash functions. So yeah, in general they are both secure, but in future, I don't know, probably elliptic curve is the way to go. Yeah. So that is equivalent to saying, like, should we use some cryptographic algorithm which is quantum secure or not? So essentially, for now, it might not really matter. But yeah, if in future quantum computers become a reality, then we do have Shor's algorithm, which can break RSA. So yeah, we need algorithms which are quantum secure. And yeah, at some point of time in the future, if quantum computers become a reality, the blockchain ecosystem might break. So yeah, eventually they'll have to transition to some elliptic curve secure algorithms throughout, be it encryptions, be it hash functions, be it zero knowledge proof algorithms, everything.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
So anything, any question with respect to the R1CSs, the QAPs? The talk will go slightly uphill. I promise you it will not, it will not last longer, the maths part. We are almost there. But as of now, if there is any question corresponding to the ZK-SNARK material, yeah, I'll be happy to answer. We are almost done with the maths part. Okay. So I think I'll go ahead. So yeah, before moving to the next slide, let's just quickly take a recap of what we have done so far. So we wanted to prove some function. We took that function, we flattened the code. From that code, we got an arithmetic circuit. We figured out that every gate in this arithmetic circuit imposes some constraints on the inputs, the auxiliary outputs, and auxiliary inputs. We wrote those constraints in the R1CS form. And we desired to have a solution vector such that all of those R1CS constraints are solved simultaneously. In our attempt to do something better, we thought of representing that R1CS those bunch of R1CS constraints in form of polynomials, and we arrived at the following QAP, which for which we require that the equation ax times bx minus cx should be 0 for all x. What that essentially means is they should be 0 for all x corresponding, should be 0 for all x corresponding to the circuit gates. And what that essentially means is that when you put in any value of x corresponding to circuit gates, you get a constraint corresponding to, so you get the R1CS constraint corresponding to that gate. And essentially this states that you want that all of these constraints should be satisfied simultaneously. However, there's a easier way to check them. Okay, so let's go ahead. So what we want is that this this polynomial equation holds, which means I'm sorry. I don't know. Yeah, okay. So which means that somehow this is coming on my screen. I'm not sure why. See a second. Okay. Okay. So what we want is that this equation holds for all the gates. So recall when we say that this should hold for all gates, we essentially, what we are essentially saying is that the equation ax times bx minus cx is divisible by this polynomial x minus I, where I takes value for all the gates. So in this case, 1 to the number of gates. Now this is straightforward to see, because essentially what we are saying is that I is the root for each of for this polynomial equation. And if I is a root, then the polynomial is divisible by x minus I. So for all i's which are root, in this case 1 to gates, this polynomial should be divisible by this bigger polynomial, which is a product of x minus I, which is like the product of all the roots of this equation. We call this polynomial as a target polynomial, t of x. So t of x comprises of all the roots, which is like all the gates. So essentially, the QAP boils down to the following equation, which is ax times bx minus cx is equal to some polynomial h of x times tx. So why h of x? Because all we can guarantee here is that the polynomial on the left of the equality is 0 for all values of x corresponding to the gates. But in general, that does not mean that it will be 0 for all values of x. So there could be some polynomial, and there would be some polynomial h of x, which will be divisible by this target. I mean, like when you divide the left side of the polynomial by the target polynomial, you get this polynomial h of x. So the target polynomial t of x is publicly known, and h of x is, and the rest of them are not. So a, b, c, and h are not. Okay. Where a of x is simply summation of si times ai xi. It's a dot product. So if we know the solution vector S, okay, essentially what this means is we know all the SIs corresponding to all the gates. Then for any given value E, we can compute the value A, B, C, and H of E, right? Because that is equivalent to simply substituting the value in your polynomial equation. Okay, there are two things. So one is the polynomial and the other is you given any E. But what do we mean by when we say we know the polynomial A, B, and C and we can compute them? So essentially, if we see at this pink part on the right, A of x is nothing but summation of Si times AIX, and B is summation of Si, BIX, and so on. So when we say this, what we mean actually is that we know the solution vector SIs, which is a secret, because the solution vector is what is, so solution vector is something which is assigned to each of the gates and the outputs and the auxiliary variables in the entire circuit, which is essentially saying that you know the inputs. So if imagine a huge circuit which computes the hash function, what you're saying is you know the input such that a public output was produced, right? So this entire solution vector is secret to you. So if you know the input, you can simply run the algorithm, which is like you give this input to the inputs of the circuit corresponding to the SHA, and you just compute the value of each of the auxiliary variables, and you have the entire solution vector with you. So this is equivalent to saying, when we say we know SIs, this is equivalent to saying we know the secret values S, such that, you know, a certain output is produced, right? And if the circuit under consideration is corresponding to some NP complete statement or some function such as SHA function, we want this S essentially to be a secret input, and we want to prove that we know, for instance, the plain text which is hashed to this particular value, which is like publicly present output. So what would be the proof? So essentially the proof would be that for any evaluation point E, which is chosen randomly by the verifier and sent to the prover, you generate A of E, B of E, C of E, and H of E, which is the desired proof. And the point E is sent in a hidden form, and the polynomial have to be evaluated blindly. We use elliptic curve pairings to as the underlying hidden scheme. So the rest of this rest of this part of this talk, we'll just spend next 10 minutes to understand what do we mean by, and why do we want these E's to be sent in a hidden form, and what do we mean by polynomials have to be evaluated blindly, right? So essentially, so far with our understanding of math, what we see is that, okay, I have a polynomial, you give me a point, I'll just simply substitute the point and get a value, right? But we don't want that point to be sent to you publicly, because there are certain more assumptions which go into place, and essentially I don't want to reveal my polynomial, which is corresponding to, you know, the solution vector for my problem. So we'll take 4 steps to understand what exactly this means. So we'll talk of homomorphic hiding schemes, and then we'll see what is blind evaluation of polynomial using homomorphic schemes. And then we'll talk something which is known as knowledge of coefficient assumption, and we'll see how we can use these techniques to blindly evaluate a polynomial which is verifiable. So homomorphic scheme is very straightforward and very simple. So homomorphic hiding can simply be defined as any hiding E of X, such that given a E of X, it's hard to find X. Okay. Given X and Y such that X is not equal to Y, then E of X is not equal to EY, which means that different inputs lead to different outputs in this hiding. And if one knows the homomorphic hiding of X and Y, then you can compute the arithmetic, some arithmetic expressions over X and Y. So such that if you have homomorphic of X and Y, you can compute homomorphic hiding of X plus Y. Okay. So let's see an example. So consider a simple group ZP where P is a large prime. So the elements of the group is 1, 2, 3, and 2P minus 1, which is a cyclic group. So there is a generator G. What does mean is that you can take this generator G and you can generate any element of this entire group. So for large P, it is known that the discrete log problem is hard in such a group, right? So given any H corresponding to ZP star, we know that there exists a such that G to the A is H mod P. However, it's difficult to find such an A, which is a basis for a lot of cryptographic algorithms. Further, it's easy to see that if I give you 2 such elements, so let's say G to the A and G to the B, you can simply multiply these 2 elements and get another element, which is G to the A plus B modulo P minus 1. So it satisfies our properties of homomorphic hiding. So such a group could be like such a, so one such homomorphic hiding scheme is that E to the X is, like E of X is simply G to the X, where G is the generator of this large group. So we can see that it satisfies the property of homomorphic hiding because it's difficult to invert because discrete log is hard. 2 different elements will give you 2 different outputs. And if you know the homomorphic hiding of 2 elements, then you can compute homomorphic hiding of E to the E of X plus Y. Okay. So can we use them for blind evaluation of polynomials? So imagine this polynomial, which is a naught plus a1x plus a2x square and so on for some degree d. So evaluating this polynomial p at any point s belonging to fp, you simply substitute the value s in this entire polynomial. And it's easy to see that p is simply a linear combination of the values 1, s, s square, and s to the d. So this a naught, a1, a2, a3, and so on give you the coefficient for this linear combination. Also, we discussed about this homomorphic hiding, and it's simply to see that this homomorphic, the expressions which we can compute for these homomorphic hiding schemes, they can be extended to the linear combinations as well. So for instance, we saw that given g to the x and g to the y, you can compute g to the x times y, which is like e of x plus y. But you can do better. You can also compute e of ax plus by, which is simply e of x to the a times e of x to the b, e of y to the b. Right. So we can use these techniques to blindly compute the polynomial. So let's say Alice has some polynomial p in her mind, which is this a naught plus a1x and so on. And Bob has some element from this group s. So Alice can send this polynomial px to Bob. And Bob can simply compute, substituting this s, can compute e of p of s. So Bob can compute p of s. And essentially, once you have p of s, you can compute e of p of s. But you don't want that, because Alice does not want to reveal the polynomial, because remember we said that this polynomial is corresponding to the solution vector. So you don't want to reveal that vector. Okay. The other ways is that Bob actually sends s to Alice, and this Alice computes e of p of s. So she uses this s, substitutes in p of x, and then computes the homomorphic hiding of p of s and send it to Bob. Now we don't want to do that because Bob does not want to reveal s. Okay, so there's a problem. Bob does not want to give s to Alice, and Alice does not want to give the polynomial p to Bob. How do we solve this problem? So recall from here that given the homomorphic hiding of g to the x and g to given the homomorphic hiding of x and y, you can compute any linear combination over that. So that's what Bob does. So Bob sends the homomorphic hiding of all the coefficients. It sends 1, s, s square, and s to the d. So it sends the homomorphic hiding of all of these coefficients, which now Alice can use directly to compute e of p of s and can send it to Bob. Now, due to the property of homomorphic hiding, with the values e of 1, s, s square, and sd, Alice cannot figure out what exactly is s, because discrete log is hard. And similarly, getting the homomorphic hiding of the polynomial computed at s, Bob cannot reveal what exactly is the polynomial or what exactly is the value corresponding to p of s. Right. So yeah, so that's the basic which we'll use in the next few slides. So fair enough. So far what we have seen is that there is a way which Bob can send Alice some values and get e of p of s. But how do we know that Alice actually computed the polynomial on these points and sent you the homomorphic hiding corresponding to that? Alice very well could have sent any gibberish value such as 42, right? So how do we ensure that Alice actually sent e to the e of p of s instead of some gibberish value? So what comes handy in this is something known as KC assumption, which is knowledge of coefficient of assumption. So let's simplify this as following. So imagine this g of p, which is where discrete log is hard, and instead of multiplicative, let's think of it in additive sense. So given an alpha belonging to fp and a and b in g, an alpha pair is such that this b is equal to alpha of a. So if I say, like, let's say a 5 pair, so 3 and 15 are a 5 pair, right? So basically a and b are alpha pairs if b is equal to alpha of a, right? So similarly 3 and 125 and so on. So yeah, so given any two alpha pairs, so now Bob can choose a random alpha and a random element A in G, and he wants to compute, and he computes B of alpha, and he sends this A comma B to Alice. And what it requires is, now it requires Alice to send back another alpha pair, you know. So Alice has to compute another alpha pair here. So if Alice knows the value of alpha, she can pick up any value K and then do a alpha times K, and send K alpha K to Bob, which will be a valid alpha pair. But Alice does not know what the value of alpha is. And due to the discrete log problem, reversing the value and getting the value of alpha is hard. So Alice has just one way to compute the alpha pair, which is she now chooses a random B from this FP and computes a random beta from this FP and computes beta dot A times beta dot B. Now, since A and B are alpha pairs, so will beta dot A and beta dot B be, right? So this A prime and B prime will be alpha pairs. And because Bob knows the value of alpha, he can simply check whether they are alpha pairs or not, right? But this does not stop at this point. So now there are multiple ways. So now Bob could send potentially D different alpha pairs, A naught, B naught, A1, Bn, and so on, and can require Alice to send another alpha pair. And Alice can use any linear combination of these D different pairs and send another A prime, B prime. So at this point of time, Bob can simply check whether A prime and B prime are alpha pairs. But apart from that, he does not know what exactly is the linear combination of A naught to AD, which Alice used to generate these alpha pairs. So he does not know what is this linear combination. He just knows that they are the alpha pair, because all he does is that he takes this A prime and multiplies it by alpha, because he knows alpha and whether he gets a B prime or not. Right? So yeah, so can we use this to ensure that when I send any hiding of point S to Alice, Alice actually computes the values corresponding to the polynomial and does not just simply return me a random value. So to do that, we notice that this P, which the P polynomial which we want, is actually a linear combination of 1 S, S square, and S to the D. So what Bob now does is that he chooses this alpha and has a evaluation point S, which is secret in his mind, and he sends the homomorphic hiding of the alpha pairs corresponding to 1 S, S square, and S to the D, which means he sends S, a homomorphic hiding of 1 and alpha, S and alpha S, S square and alpha S square, and so on. Now Alice needs to compute these two values, which is E of PS and alpha E of PS, and he sends this newly computed alpha pairs back to Bob, which is A prime and B prime, which is homomorphic hiding of PS and homomorphic hiding of E of PS. And Bob can simply verify whether the two homomorphic hidings which Alice has returned are actually alpha pairs. That means that whether they have been computed using the same polynomial or a linear combination in mind or not. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. So what we have achieved here is that I know this linear combination SIs. So as a verifier, you can send me any hidden value E. And if I know such an SI, I can compute A of E, B of E, C of E, and H of E, and send it back to you, where I can simultaneously have two things. One, I don't know what exactly is the evaluation point, and I still can give you the values evaluated at a point which is unknown to me, which you can easily verify. And at the same time, because I'm using homomorphic hiding to send you these values, you are not aware of what exactly is the polynomial that I had in mind. Essentially, what that means is you don't know what exactly is the secret solution vector S that I have in mind. Okay, so we'll take a break here in case there is any question regarding this. So essentially the proof consists of these values A, E, B, E, C, E, and H of E, which you can simply check and verify whether the whole or not. So yeah, we have roughly half an hour left. So I understand this second part of the talk was a bit math heavy. And my intention was to like introduce you to the basic concepts which are involved in such zero knowledge proofs. Once you understand the zero knowledge proofs in general and what exactly is zk-SNARKs, and you have enough pointers to look them yourself, and such that the literature might make sense to you if you look at these constructions so far. But the major takeaway till this point of time is essentially you can take any NP statement, and there is a way to generate a proof for that statement where you can prove that a certain statement holds true or not without revealing the actual secrets correspond or the witness corresponding to that particular NP statement. So yeah, in case there are any questions, otherwise yeah, let's move ahead. Okay, so shall I go ahead? Are there any questions? Oh, it was TDS you asked. Okay. I heard elliptic curves, EDCS. Okay. Sorry about that. Yes, there is. So this constructions is mainly from this paper known as Pinocchio. So I can send a link around to the organizer, and they can probably forward it to you guys at the end of the session. Yeah, I would recommend you to go through that paper, and I think going through that paper will make much more sense after now. Yeah. Is there any other question? Okay, I think not. So yeah, let me just go ahead with this. Okay, so thanks for bearing with me till now. So I understand the second part was heavy, and yeah, there is no way to do justice with zero knowledge proofs while avoiding those mathematical gory details. So I tried to keep it simple, and still I think yeah, I'm afraid I might have lost some of you. But yeah, time to come back to look at this application, and hopefully this application might cheer you up a bit. Okay, so this is one of our recent works which was published in IEEE blockchain, where we use zero knowledge proofs to construct a privacy preserving solution for supply chains, which gives you a traceability guarantees and something which we call contamination tracing. So I might skip over to the part of contamination tracing a bit. So I'll go fast over contamination tracing, and towards the end of the talk, if we still have time and people are interested, we might revisit contamination tracing. So because that is using some cryptographic techniques known as cryptographic accumulators. Yeah, so we'll focus on the zero knowledge aspects of this solution which we presented. So this was a joint work with Nitin and Pankaj from IBM Research. Yeah, so let's go ahead. So supply chains, I think with the globalization of these markets, they have become complex, and they are practically everywhere. So from everything, ranging from the food we eat to the mobile phones we use, to the laptop screens we are watching this talk right now. Everything goes through this complex process of supply chains, from procuring raw data to manufacturing and eventually getting hold of it to as the end consumer. And yeah, with these different parts of these devices and that's raw materials being produced in different countries across oceans, the supply chain has become complex, and there is a avid need of people to collaborate on some system. However, the actors of the supply chain, they do not completely trust each other, because in a supply chain there are potentially business secrets that go around. For instance, what is the price at which you bought a product, or what is a deal that you have stricken? Let's say Apple has deal with Samsung to get some mobile screens. So what is the price, and so on and so forth. So those things are trade secrets, and you do not want to reveal those trade secrets. But at the same time, as an end consumer and as a business, you would want transparency and traceability. So transparency in the sense that if someone says, let's say that you are getting a product manufactured, so let's say you are getting wheat, which is, so you're getting wheat flour which is produced using wheat which was grown in Punjab, then that is essentially what is happening, and you are actually have a guarantee that what you are consuming is coming from a certain source of acquisition. So the second concern is transparency. So you would not want the secrets to be hidden. You would want a perfect transparency and the traceability of the products which you are using, you are consuming. So there have been cases in the past where this lack of traceability resulted in huge financial losses. So in somewhere around 2006, no, I'm sorry, is there a question? Okay. I guess someone unmuted him. Okay, let's go ahead. So in 2006, there was this E. coli outbreak in the US where some fresh spinach bags were affected by this E. coli bacteria, and this resulted in a mass outbreak of E. coli. And the US authorities actually stopped the sales of all this fresh spinach, and the entire supply chain of this fresh spinach came to the halt until they identified from the source of the of that contaminated lot for that spinach. So what this resulted is that there was a huge lot of product which was wasted at stores, and even the farmers faced huge losses, and the entire supply chain was halted for several weeks, which resulted in huge financial losses. Things like these could have been easily solved if at an instant you would be able to trace that, hey, this is the lot which was contaminated, where did this originate from? So this it was found that this lot originated from a small farm, and later on they blocked all the supply from that particular farm, and the rest of the supply chain resumed. But yeah, by the time there was a huge loss in the market. Also, this transparency, they brings confidence in organization as well as end consumer. So as end consumer, you know what you are consuming, you know what product you are using, where did it come from. So for instance, there could be a defense requirement where, let's say, Indian Army wants that any system on chip design that we are using in any of our systems or missile systems or aircrafts, we want to ensure that none of them actually cross the borders of, let's say, China or any other country for that matter. So how do they ensure that this has been the case? Because how do they track that everything? How do they completely track the entire supply chain in that sense? So transparency brings confidence in both the organizations which are dealing with each other and also as the end consumer. So in general, a supply chain process is a complex set of processes which involves some strategy, some planning, and some asset management, and so on. But in this work, we are just concerned with the logistic procurement and product lifecycle management of the supply chain. However, each of these documents corresponding to this procurement, manufacturing, batching, warehousing, transportation, distribution, selling, and so forth, they correspond to some document in the real world, right? So for instance, you might see an invoice as an end consumer. That is what we are familiar with. So an invoice is simply a document which records that who was the seller, who is the buyer, the date, time, what is the item, the quantity, what is the price, what is total, and taxes paid, and so on and so forth. So all these complicated information, they are stored in something which is known as invoice. And in similar sense, there are a lot of different documents which it can indicate each of these processes in the supply chain at hand. And each of these documents, they can be represented as certain key value pairs. So essentially over, a JSON or an XML in the real world. So you can have a JSON document which has a key value pair representing each of this. They have a unique identifier such as the invoice number, and they can refer to other documents. So they can have all these fancy features where you can refer to a batch number a lot. So imagine a medical bill where you know exactly what batch your medicine was from, and corresponding to batch number, there will be another document which says what was the medicine which was produced, and so on. So the data values in these documents, they can be privacy sensitive, right? So you might not want to reveal the exact value. However, the keys, they are well known. So an invoice has a certain structure. So what you fill in those values is something which may be, I think someone is unmuted. Okay. Yeah. So the values of this document, they can be privacy sensitive. So imagine a tax invoice corresponding to a shipping. So you might not want to reveal what exactly is the item, what is the price of the item, and what is the what is the exact sender and the buyer or the seller of the item, and so on. However, for exercise related reasons, you might want to ensure that the correct excise duty and the correct import taxes have been paid on that document. How do you do that without revealing the entire document? Okay, so the key objectives is that we want the privacy of the business sensitive data. We want to have unlinkability, where we do not want to reveal the business relationship from the public data which is present. And we want to have some traceability, which is like you need to have the provenance of the product. So if you say that a certain product originated from a certain source, then yeah, I need to be ensured that this is the case. And additionally, we want contamination tracing, but yeah, at least for the first part, we'll be skipping through contamination tracing. So there's a lot of related work that has happened in the past. So there's something known as IBM Food Trust, which gives a blockchain-based solution for these supply chains. And they have actually, in collaboration with Walmart, they have deployed it to track food products from across the globe. However, it again lacks the privacy preserving guarantees. But IBM, as we mentioned earlier, so it uses something similar to the concepts of Hyperledger Fabric. So it has concepts of channels where you can hide the participants from one channel to the other, and it provides some compartmentalization, but does not give a privacy preserving guarantees in the sense that any participant in a channel can see in plain text what are the transactions that are happening. Similarly, there is Medinerger, which uses zero-knowledge proofs to give proof of transactions while protecting the actual data. And then there is Decouples, which gives the privacy-preserving traceability and unlinkability of transactions. But they fail to consider these complex supply chain operations, such as splitting a lot into different lots, or merging a lot into a batch, and so on. Okay. So in this work, we actually came up with a supply chain model analogous to real world, and we gave a privacy preserving framework for tracking provenance and efficient contamination tracing, while accounting for complex supply chain operations such as splitting and merging. And the framework was fairly modular in nature. So what are the operations that we want to support? Okay. So the major operations which we support here are, so let's try to build up the problem statement before we get into the zero-knowledge part. So the major kind of operations which we want to support is like enter, transfer, split, merge, and process, and which you can imagine in the real world. So entry is simply, you introduce a raw material or a primary commodity into the supply chain. Then you transfer an item from one entity to another entity, or you split a lot into several different lots, or you merge several different lots into a single lot, or you process, let's say, manufacture something using the raw material. So we'll see an example. And finally, the sale of the product to the end consumer, which marks the exit of the item in the supply chain. So let's see the simple example. So here there are three primary commodities, the cocoa beans, milk, and sugarcane. So let's start from the top row. So the cocoa beans enter into the supply chain, and then they are split into two different lots. One lot is used to produce cocoa powder. The other lot goes to the manufacturing of chocolate, which takes further two inputs, which is milk and sugarcane. The sugarcane is used to produce some sugar, and finally the milk, sugarcane, and the cocoa beans are combined to produce a chocolate, and finally the chocolate is sent to the end consumer. So we can simply see that these processes, so all of these processes are given by these documents. So there's a document corresponding to entry of the product into the supply chain, and similarly to the slate, to process, and to transfer, and eventually to exit the product from the supply chain. So all of them are corresponding to this document. So what was in document? Document was just simple a key value document such as JSON or XML, where the keys are sort of publicly known, so you know what exactly an invoice would look like. However, the values corresponding to each document is business sensitive, and you do not want to reveal the exact values. However, you would want to maintain the traceability, provenance, and tracking of these products. So a typical document structure would contain elements such as the type of the document, which indicates what exactly is the process. It will be a shipping process, or it's a entry process, exit process, or a transfer, or anything of like that. A document hash, which is a Merkle hash for the entire contents of the document. So imagine these content listed as the leaf nodes of the document, and you have the content of the document. And then they have a unique identifier, which is a prime corresponding to a document, and there is accumulator and index. So we'll skip what accumulator does, but let's circle back if we have enough time and interest towards the end. So yeah, okay. Okay. So what is a document hash? So document hash is simply you construct a Merkle tree corresponding to all the values of the document. So it's a key value store. So you can imagine it as like a key value pairs, where you take each value and you use them as a leaf node of a Merkle tree, and you just combine them to generate a Merkle tree root hash. The root hash of this Merkle tree is the document hash. So this document hash hides the actual content of the document. However, it still maintains certain structure in what the exact document is. So how do we ensure that this root hash is well formed, and what does the exact blockchain transaction look like, which will be creating these document assets? So a typical transaction would look in the blockchain would look something of this sort, where a transaction will contain a document type, the hash of the document, the certificate corresponding to the primality, the set of indocs and outdocs, and a proof pi. So this pi this proof pi will ensure that the document is well formed. So what do we mean by well formed? So we'll explain next. So imagine there's a shipping document, right? So this document will contain certain key value pairs, which is corresponding to the document ID, the date, the sender and the receiver of the particular item, what exactly is the item, what is the quantity, what is the price of that item, and so on and so forth. Similarly, while receiving, there would be a challan corresponding to this sender, and then the receiver will have that invoice. And at later point of time, it will be using some document derived from this shipping document to further send this document, where there will be a document which will be matched to that, hey, I got this product from this particular invoice, and yeah, I'm using this product to process and produce this raw material to process and produce this final product. So there are a couple of things which are identical in these documents. For instance, the receiver in the document D1 corresponds to the owner in document D2. The item and the quantity and the price, etc., they match. So essentially this D1 and D2 have a following relationship among them. So D1.receiver is D2.owner, D1.item is same as D2.item, D1.quantity is same as D2.quantity. So how do we verify them? So it would have been a straightforward task to verify if D1 and D2 satisfy this predicate shown in blue, had this been in plain text. But remember, the actual contents of these documents are not available in plain text. In fact, we generate a Merkle tree, Merkle hash out of it, and we produce a hash of the contents of these individual documents. So we show the well-formedness of these documents in zero knowledge. So what exactly, so we have seen so far that most of these efficient construction, they prove statement in the form of arithmetic circuit satisfiability, where you map the predicates that you want to prove to the arithmetic circuits. And for blockchain-based verification, we need the faster on-chain verification and proof sizes, because essentially it will be replicated throughout the blockchain, and it will be verified by numerous miners and validators of the blockchain. So we used something similar to ZK SNARKs in the pre-processing model, so which is what we discussed in the previous part of this talk. However, if you recall, they do lack flexibility, which means that the computations, they need to be known beforehand, and you need a one-time trusted setup for each of the computations. So we overcome that problem by introducing a set of basic gadgets. And further, we change the proofs of these basic gadgets to prove the predicates. So I'll spare the details of what exactly is the intuition behind the gadgets, but essentially what we want is we don't want to generate a arithmetic circuit and do the setup for every particular predicate or property of the form shown here in blue. Instead, we want some way where you give me any predicate which uses these gadgets of type and inequality and addition and so on, and I'll be able to compute a zero knowledge proof without doing a circuit, without doing trusted setup again. Okay, so what does the gadget add look like? So this is the NP statement corresponding to gadget add, where given you three hashes, h of x, h of y, and h of z, I want to claim that I know x and y and three random numbers rx, ry, and rz, such that h of x, hx is simply hash of the plain text value x concatenated with this random rx. Hy is the hash of y concatenated with ry, and similarly h of z is hash of x plus y concatenated with rz. So I want to prove this in zero knowledge. So this will be my NP statement corresponding to proving this gadget add. So notice here that the publicly known inputs here are hx, hy, and hz, which are hashes. So using hx, hy, and hz, you cannot determine what is the exact value of x, y, and z. At the same time, rx and ry and rz are just random numbers to hide the values x and y further, so that two documents having same x and y, it does not reveal what these two documents have the same values of x and y, because essentially the hash would be the same. So the secret inputs are x, y, and the random number rx, ry, and rz. And we want to prove in zero knowledge that we know these secret inputs x, y, rx, ry, and rz, as well as x plus y is equal to z. So I know a secret z such that z is equal to x plus y. In the similar terms, there will be other gadgets for computing and for computing equality, which is like I know x, y, and the random number rx, ry, and rz, such that x and y is equal to z. And in gadget equal, I know x, rx, and ry, such that x is equal to y. So using this for any logical construct that we want to prove, such as shown in the previous slide, we construct basic parsing of that predicate, and then we chain proofs of these basic gadgets to prove these predicate. While doing this, we inherit the benefits of the faster verification and the smaller proof sizes from the pre-processing SNARKs. And simultaneously, using these gadgets, we overcome the limitation of setup per computation. And we are able to prove these um, in comparatively very fast time. So the experimental result, so accumulators I'll skip. So for the SNARK gadget, the proof generation and verification times are in milliseconds, where we can see that the verification of proof, which goes onto the blockchain, so you can verify the proof within like around 40 milliseconds. And at the same time, the proof generation takes somewhere around a couple of seconds, to from 3 seconds to 16 seconds. But that is not a problem, because most of this proof generation happens off chain. The sizes of these proofs will be small enough within a few KBs. However, it's not, I guess, shown here. Okay, yeah, we have that. So the sizes of these transactions will be a couple of bytes, and the generation and the verification time for each of these transactions are given in the second, where again, we can see that the generation might take somewhere around 40 seconds in a single thread model, where the verification takes just a couple of milliseconds, where the sizes range from around 640 bytes to 1.6 KB and so. So the transactions sizes are small, which is important because it is replicated, and the proof verification times are small as well, which needs to be computed by which needs to be verified by every miner of the system. To sum it up, in this work we presented a system for enabling traceability and privacy preserving manner. And the model of the supply chain was analogous to the real world, which supports efficient verification and which can be instantiated with any SNARK construction. However, the results are shown which were computed using the Pinocchio model. Apart from that, in the rest of the talk, we understood what exactly are zero knowledge proofs and what are ZK SNARKs and how are ZK SNARKs computed, and how we can use them in a blockchain based setting. Apart from this work, yeah, I would recommend reading Zcash as well. So I'll send that link as well to the organizers, and they can probably share with you. So the Zcash paper is one of the first papers which used ZK SNARKs, which is exactly the construction which we discussed in this talk. I mean, in detail, of course. So it uses those constructions to give an alternative to Bitcoin, where you hide the actual contents of the transaction, the sender, receiver, and the amount of cryptocurrency that you are transferring. Still, you are able to verify whether these transactions are well formed or not. So that was one of the first application of zero knowledge proofs over blockchain. And ever since, there are a couple of these results that have come up, and people are using zero knowledge proofs in various privacy preserving applications on top of blockchains, such as the supply chain work, which we saw here. And there are a couple of works earlier like MediLedger and Decouples, and even Ethereum is trying to come up with something known as Zocrates to have zero knowledge enabled smart contracts. So yeah, those would be the pointers you could just go and try to read into. And the paper corresponding to which the second part of this talk was entirely based on, I'll just send a link to the organizers to share with you. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Participants, now the time for you can ask any queries this particular area, or else you can post in the chat window. Sir, I think they are cleared about the particular topic and all. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for sharing your valuable insights on this emerging and challenging topic, zero knowledge proof. And definitely, I'm sure our participant gained knowledge in this area.
Okay, I hope the participants don't go back with zero knowledge. So, in fact, yeah, okay. I just, I'll just send the links along to the organizer. and
sure,
yeah,
sir.
it can be shared to the participants. And yeah,
Definitely.
thanks a lot for being a
Thank
wonderful
you.
participant.
Sir, one question
Oh,
is
there
there
is a
in the
question.
chat window. Yeah.
Well, I don't know what exactly you mean by simulating a blockchain network. So if you mean like running a private blockchain network and playing around with it, so most of these blockchains have their clients. For example, Ethereum has its own Ethereum client, and Hyperledger Fabric, you can set up the entire network using Docker. So based upon the blockchain that you are interested in, you can very well set up a private network, and you can create your own smart contracts. You can interact with the blockchain. You can play around using the wallets and all. Similarly, in Hyperledger Fabric, you can set up your own blockchain network. I mean, there's plenty of documentation around, but yes, they all have their own clients, and they all have their own SDKs to develop smart contracts and run smart contracts on your private network. So you need not go to the actual mainnet to test these things out. You can set up things in your own. Okay, suppose you want to model. Yeah, so this is interesting. So this is again fairly involved, but just simply go to the blockchain you are interested in, and you can find their codes in GitHub. So they usually have a well-structured and a very helpful community, and you can just go and update the particular consensus part. So I know for Hyperledger Fabric, we tried to do something. So we tried to implement Raft and BFT at some point earlier. So those codes are, I mean, yeah, I think they have their codes in GitHub, and based upon what particular algorithm you want to implement, they have fairly structured code repository. And if you are well versed with implementing these distributed systems, or you have experience in implementing the consensus algorithm, which actually comes from the distributed world as well, so you can simply you can fork the code and you can try to implement your own consensus algorithm. It's not really as hard as it sounds. So yeah, just head to GitHub. I think you'll find some. If you are starting up, I think if you have no prior experience with blockchains and you are completely starting up, I mean, one good exercise would be to implement your own blockchain using Python or Java or something, which has its own consensus algorithm. So it does not. It sounds complicated, but it's really not that complicated. It's a simple code which runs on multiple nodes, and you can have a simple consensus algorithm in play, and that will give you a very good clarity of what it is. Yeah, GitHub is the best place. Anything else? Okay. Faraz has nothing. So
Yes. So thank you, sir. So we have come to the conclusion. So thank you so much, all the participants, for attending this session. So your feedback link is available in this chat window. You can finish it off. Those who finish, you can leave the meeting. Thank you all.
thanks a lot, guys.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you so much, sir.